Okay, so thanks for joining us today. My name is Shelley McSpedden. I'm a curator at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. Today I'll be talking with Sydney-based artist Tully Arnot about a major new work that he's doing for the third and final Mordant Family VR Commission. Before we begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the Darug and the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, on whose land Tully and I respectively work, and we're remotely meeting from here. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all nations of this land. So the Mordant Family VR Commission has been held at ACMI for the past 3 years, and it supports Australian visual artists who've established a practice in some other medium to kind of experiment and extend their practice using VR technologies. Commissioned artists such as Tully receive $80,000 to develop the project, and they also get the fabulous support of curatorial support from ACMI curators and presentation support. Tully's work will be eventually shown at ACMI once we relaunch after the coronavirus has gone on its way. And the VR Commission is a partnership between Catriona Mordant, Simon Mordant, the City of Melbourne and ACMI. So Tully has established a really substantial sculptural and installation practice that explores the way that we interact with technology, with nature and with each other. I'd say he has a very kind of absurdist bent and often combines really kind of complex technologies with everyday materials in a way that really kind of makes us look at the world around us in kind of different ways and shifts our perspective of it. Tully's work sort of foregrounds these kind of intangible dimensions of our relationship with the things around us. And in doing so, he really suggests new ways of thinking and interacting with that world around us and with the kind of material, physical world around us. His recent work engages with the emergent fields of plant robotics and the tension between organic and digital existences. So thanks for talking with me today, Tully. It's great to have this opportunity. I know you're in the middle of developing this project for the Commission, and loosely I know that the project engages with plant movement and plant communication systems. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your interest in this field and what really drew you to kind of use visual VR technologies. Like what kind of made you want to kind of explore this medium?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. I think I grew up spending a lot of time in the bush with a very large backyard, kind of going to a bit of a hippie bush school for a while. And so interactions with natural environments were always a part of myself, my identity. But I think in terms of it coming into my creative practice, there was a pivotal moment in 2013 reading Michael Pollan's article in the New Yorker, The Intelligent Plant. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was a really interesting thing where he had brought together a lot of different theorists and writers and looked at plant sciences and the way that new technology was allowing an understanding of plant communication or plant memory or interaction in a way that really left behind what was happening in the 60s and built on more rigorous scientific knowledge. So it's something that at first glance does seem a little bit imaginative, but then there's a lot of science to back it up. So reading his article, I started working with plants in my own work. Initially, I was very interested in technology and robotics and different things like that, and created these robotic plants which interacted, responded to viewers and audiences. And then more recently in 2018, I think it was, I created a work at Carriageworks for Performance Space, which was a dance piece, which was an interaction between a dancer and bean plants, and looking at that bodily communication, that bodily interaction as a form of communication. In terms of virtual reality, I've always been interested in how we mediate our relationships through consumer technology. The way that the technology creates this sort of interface and can kind of stand in for a lot of those different relationships. So virtual reality being a cutting edge consumer technology is something that was obviously very interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a real extension of, you know, the different kind of digital platforms that you've played with in your sculptural practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of technology, it's a fantastic example of, you know, in coronavirus times, the way that everything is mediated. You know, with a virtual reality headset, you can somewhat inhabit other worlds or interact with people in the same way that we're doing, you know, right now through Zoom or, you know, on house party with our friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? How, the coronavirus is making us kind of connect and reach out into the world through these mediated ways, and how they can kind of fill a void, I guess, of that kind of face-to-face connection.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got this kind of ongoing interest in plants then, and something that you've been exploring, and the language of plants and these kind of physical language of plants. And I know that you've been working on this project in consultation with the plant scientist, Professor Monica Gagliona. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Gagliano.
Yeah. So she's a pioneering researcher in plant science and communication. So I guess, what has she added to this project? What are you kind of taking from her kind of, depth of knowledge in this field?
Yeah, so I happened upon Monica Gagliano through Michael Pollan's essay. And she was based in Western Australia at the time, and I guess was the closest academic to me geographically. And I was interested in her work, and luckily enough, Ed was in Perth a few years back, I think 2016, and just wrote to her out of the blue, and we met up and established communication then. And she's really interesting. She is a plant biologist. She came from animal biology but moved into plants. And she had a book, The Language of Plants, that she put out in 2017, which looked, it's kind of threefold. It looked at plant biology, the way that we can now measure communication between plants through chemical signaling, different things like the rhizomatic connections through root systems, but at the same time also looked at literary references, how we sort of frame what plants are through stories, and then looked at philosophical understandings of plants and our relationships with them. So things that took more of a post-human perspective within that. And I think that's a really strong perspective for a scientist to take. I think it's very easy for people to really silo themselves in their own fields, and she's very much about creating connections with other faculties. And I guess she's a very interesting person because she can, you know, when you ask her a question, she says, you know, do you want me to answer as a scientist or answer as a gardener or answer as, you know, a person that has a more emotional connection to plants? And, you know, we can all be these different things that at times contradict themselves. And I think within all of our different industries, there's not as much room for contradiction, but I think it's really, I'm really excited by the way that she approaches things from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, so this project's a kind of an interesting space, I guess, for her as well, the science and the art kind of converging in a kind of experiential mode as well. So there's these, you know, this convergence.
Yeah.
Which possibly opens up new things.
Yeah. Well, she's moved to Sydney now, so I get to see her a little bit more. And I recently went to a conference with her at Sydney University, which it got renamed at the last minute, but the original working title for the conference was something about brainless cognition, and it looked at cognition in different organisms, from plants to viruses to bacteria, and the way that organisms without brains are capable of cognition at a certain level. So she talks about cognition or consciousness within plants, but then within this conference there were a lot of scientists, philosophers, different people debating, what cognition is and what different organisms satisfy the criteria for cognition. And sitting in on that as an artist, I was massively out of my depth in terms of the science, but it was incredibly rewarding. And I think, it's great to have those spaces that open up for people to cross over. Yeah.
Great. So obviously, her work is around the language of plants. And I guess one of the main focal points for one of the interests that you're exploring in this project is a midpoint, the language between plants and humans, or this kind of space where they can kind of communicate to each other. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that's, informing what you're doing and how you're playing with those ideas in the actual work itself.
Yeah. Well, overall, I frame my project as a lingua franca, a sort of language between plants and humans that is part of both but exterior to both. So there's a lot of different ways that I've been approaching that. I think the most immediate one that I started working with was understanding scent or chemical emissions and how that is used by plants to communicate. But then that's a part of the work. I'm using scent in the work, but I think that just felt a little bit too straightforward. And so speaking with Monica, she mentioned, a plant can perceive infrared light and the infrared heat of an organism being around it. So understanding something that's more in line with the sort of visual interpretation, and especially given that the virtual reality headset is essentially a visual medium, trying to understand how to bring vision into that. So thinking in a sense of the use of shadow rather than the use of light, the use of sort of absence as a way of indicating presence or non-presence. And I think, we humans perceive light and shadow. Plants perceive shadow in this, it's important for them to move away from the shadow to get light. And understanding that the way that they perceive that is similar to us. It's through photoreceptors throughout the plant body, and focusing on that, less visual form of visual perception, I think sits between humans and plants much better.
Yeah, it was interesting when we were speaking previously. It really struck me, that idea of creating a virtual reality work, which in a lot of ways is really about you're playing with absence and the things you can't see a lot. It's kind of a nice challenge. But I think also we were talking about the way that, I guess I've observed that plants and nature have become a really kind of hot topic for artists working in VR, and you see a lot of that work emerging in recent, at least the last year or so. But I think a lot of that work is very about kind of replicating the kind of beauty and grandeur of nature, because I think you're really trying to do something quite different. And I guess that play with shadows and absence is really kind of indicative of that. I wondered if you could kind of talk more about sort of some of the kind of haptic experiential elements that you're kind of working on in the work as well. So kind of moving away from that kind of visual, more into the bodily, or how do you play with that in the work?
Yeah. I guess with the shadow, it's definitely, I remember when I was putting together the proposal for the commission, and I was at my collaborator Josh Hull's house. He's doing a lot of the sort of VR for me. And I walked past a window where there were some trees outside and saw the light filtering through and projecting the shadow onto the floor, and it got me really thinking of the way you can see the shadow from a canopy of a forest and how that implies nature that's not there or not immediately visible. So there's a lot about sort of what can imply something that's not there. How can I represent an ecosystem without focusing on the sublime beauty of these trees in that space? So yeah, definitely within the work, I've been developing scent emitters which are situated around the space. So it's something that I've been testing out so far, looking at how you can really build an environment just with smell. You can sort of augment the visuals with a much more bodily sense. I guess as well, the use of sound has become a really important element. So there was a little while during the development of the work where I decided to have no visuals at all and to just have sound and scent.
That's a very brave move.
and that there will be elements of the work where there's no visuals. And the sound that I've been working with, it's, I guess a lot of people don't think about the way sound is used in VR and the capabilities of the headsets in doing that. And there's a lot of things that you can do with the three-dimensionality and, very focused spatiality of sound in VR that aren't possible in real life. So you can have a sound that is emitting in a small sphere of space that is, maybe full volume in that space, but doesn't bleed at all outside of it. So in creating these soundscapes, I've put together a lot of field recordings from natural environments, and within the headset, there's still, light coming in, but there's not a representation of an environment. And you're essentially sort of, well, when I first experienced it, I was just crawling around the ground, trying to find these different sounds. There was a river that I had put underneath the ground, and so I had to really sort of put my head against the carpet to get to it. And it really creates a quite a vivid visualization of an environment when you start engaging with it like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, your work with sound. I mean, we've spoken before about the fact that you, in your day job, work as an educator at the MCA, and part of that involves the sort of audio descriptions of exhibitions. So, that kind of thinking in those other realms must be, is clearly informing your approach. Do you want to have a little expand on that in any way?
Yeah, well, I guess working in audio description for the MCA has been such a sort of there was quite a learning curve in terms of understanding how to present visual artworks for people in a non-visual way. Working with people who are visually impaired or blind, and how to best present something, communicate something for them to interpret. And because a lot of our audiences are quite old, the format is, we take them on a tour through the gallery and then sit down and have coffee and biscuits after. And there's this very nice social element to it. And I remember on my first shift, this woman was explaining, she was telling us about her house, and she was completely blind, but describing the art collection that she had at home. And she had, the halls were lined with paintings. Every room had sculptures and paintings and different things in them. And she described every single one. And it really got me thinking about how we represent sort of visual information is, it's not just with our eyes, it's through the imagination. And so that visualization of her space, I found that very interesting. Obviously, she doesn't want to live in a boring white cube of a space. She wants a vibrant place filled with artworks and interesting things like the rest of us. And thinking about how she communicated that to me and the way that language and the imagination can be part of this process.
Yeah, and that's kind of that interesting thing about how our brains and imagination fill in those gaps, I guess, or the absences. Yeah, it's really interesting. And like hearing you talk about that and hearing about you crawling around on the floor and the way that sound can function in different ways in VR than in the real world, it kind of made me wonder about, you know, what you have discovered through using this medium. What are some of the things that have maybe surprised you in working with this and kind of with VR? What have you learned, and how has that kind of extended what you're able to do, or kind of, you know, your creative remit? Have there been any major challenges or things you found frustrating about using it as a medium?
I think at first because usually I work for myself, and all of, you know, the electronics I make, I usually build them all myself and code them myself. And with this, it's a new technology that I don't understand. So working with someone else and not having that immediate feedback of creating something and then seeing how it works has been a bit difficult personally. But then at the same time, because we've been in lockdown, I've been learning a lot of VR myself and have had the opportunity. Very good citizen, upskilling. Good on you. Well, I think it mostly came about. I find it really hard to be creative at the moment, and the headspace that you need to think creatively is very different to the logical approach to learning a skill like that. And it's been a great distraction and a great sort of little project. And I think that a lot of artists really function in this good sort of autodidactic way where we've all learnt skills off YouTube. We've all sort of spent a lot of time by ourselves learning things. And so working with Unity, learning how to build virtual reality environments has been really rewarding in terms of better understanding the language and how I can communicate with Joshua Hall, who's doing the VR for me, and then also building my own environments and being able to more immediately interact with those. Yeah, interesting. And talking about Corona and being in lockdown, we talked about, you know, the mediated nature of a lot of our communication, but has it changed, or is it informing the way that you're thinking about our relationship to nature in any way, or you're already connected? I think, it has, you know, like when you say that, it makes me think about it. But I think, you know, when I go for walks, you know, I leave the house so infrequently, and I've noticed that going for walks and just looking at flowers on trees and things like that has been, you know, it's become an essential part of my day. And within the project, there's, you know, an underlying inspiration of the hanami, the flower viewing party. It's a Japanese term. And this idea of just going out to view flowers and to sit under a tree that's flowering and enjoy it. And I think that, you know, that respect for pure enjoyment of natural environments is something that I'm really developing right now. Yeah, I don't think you're alone. I'm lucky to live near some big open parks, and every day when I go for my walk, there are just so many people out there, and it is really interesting. I think there is something really comforting and almost essential about being in nature, it feels like, particularly at a time of anxiety, you know, mass anxiety. Yeah. I just wanted to talk about a few other things that kind of fed into your, you know, the project and how you've been thinking about this subject. And you mentioned to me your kind of research or interest in the L system, which I had never heard about, but the Lindenmayer system, which is a
a fractal, for this is my limited understanding, a kind of fractal system which is used to describe the behaviour of plants, or how they're sort of predicting how they're going to grow as well.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit about that and how that's kind of informing what you're doing or thinking.
Yeah, well, I think the overall, within the VR, I'm approaching a lot of different representations of implied nature or implied plants. And so that might be with the shadows falling from a canopy. It might be from the scent of, the scent of a plant or the scent of a different sort of natural phenomena. It could be from, the bioacoustics of plants or different, elements like that. But with the L system, I think it's really interesting the way that, with all science, it's a categorization or a reduction of nature. And with the L system, it's just a really beautiful extension of that to essentially an algorithm. And with that algorithm, you can create a pretty good approximation of the way that a tree will grow or the way that a bacteria will grow. And so within Unity, the VR software that we're using, there exist a few of these different L system sort of frameworks, and you can input some information and it will generate trees for you or generate different plants for you through this algorithm. And yeah, I think reducing these things to language, to an algorithm is, it I guess goes back to that sense of absence that is part of a lot of the work, or the implication of something that's not there.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's something interesting about that reduction into an algorithm or a kind of symbolic language, and how that, I wonder how that play, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about Monica's work, how her work sort of engaged with this idea of post-humanism, beyond the human, where the human is decentered. Do you feel like this is a big part of what you're trying to do, talk about?
Yeah. But it's, it's an impossible thing.
Yeah. You're also using a medium that puts a headset on a human. So, yes, it is impossible.
Yeah. But at the same time, I guess, in understanding how you can decenter the human somewhat, I guess it's like focusing on exactly how it is that we're perceiving or understanding things. And, the human visual perception is very, it's unique to us in a way that plants or a lot of other organisms don't really favour vision in the way that we do.
Yeah, sure.
And focusing on how it is that we're perceiving the world and how differently we might be able to perceive things is, it's a challenge that hopefully this work will touch on in some kind of way.
Yeah. We'd had a discussion previously about how some of your meditation practice had kind of fed into the work, and you'd mentioned this, I know that you're not Buddhist yourself, but you'd mentioned this kind of Buddhist parable, is it, where about this flower, and it kind of, I guess, encapsulates this idea of how you can kind of move beyond a kind of human language. I wondered can you tell us about that so I don't get it wrong?
Yeah, let me just remember. So I forget the term for it. What was it?
Oh yeah.
Sorry. So the flower sermon. And
yes.
So it was a teaching where it was a wordless sermon where Buddha walked in and produced a single white flower and held it in his hands. And one of the disciples smiled, and it was within the story that smile indicates that they received the information of what this sermon was, and the idea of presenting a flower and somehow transmitting wisdom through that. I find, you know, I guess it's a very interesting thing. It's essentially what we're doing with art in a weird sense, you know, presenting something that doesn't have translation in language. There's no way you could encapsulate it in language, and then it affects us in these different ways that, you know, is quite profound. I think like, when I experience art that really moves me, it's often not something that I can really articulate. And I guess maybe the flower sermon is similar to that.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a poignant moment to finish our discussion. Thank you so much for talking with me today. I'm really looking forward to seeing the work or experiencing it when we finally reopen. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.